Okay, this is one of those cases where the person doesn't disappear in silence. He disappears while someone is listening. And I don't mean listening later, or listening after the fact, or listening through a voicemail. I mean listening in real time, responding, talking back, engaged in a conversation that, up until a certain point, feels completely ordinary. He's on the phone with his parents. They can hear his voice clearly. They can hear him talking, thinking out loud, reacting to what's around him. And then, in the middle of that conversation, something happens. Not hours later, not after contact is lost, not after a gap in time you can explain away, while the line is still open. And what makes this case so unsettling is that it doesn't announce itself as dangerous. It doesn't rush at you. It doesn't come with warning signs or dramatic shifts in tone. Nothing about the beginning feels urgent or alarming, and that's part of why it stays with people once they understand where it leads. Because if you place yourself inside this night, even briefly, you start to realize that the choices being made are the same kinds of choices most people would make without thinking twice. Not reckless choices, not strange choices, normal ones. It starts with a phone call, a familiar voice, a situation that feels annoying more than scary. The kind of thing you assume will be resolved fairly quickly, maybe with some eye-rolling and frustration. And then later, it becomes a story you tell. You won't believe what happened to me that night. And then, slowly, without any clear moment where you're told to panic, it just stops making sense. Welcome to Drawn to Crime, where real mysteries unfold through animation. Before we get to the phone call, which is always the part people focus on, it helps to slow everything down and talk about the person at the center of this in a way that feels grounded and human. Not like a list of traits or a headline summary. More like asking, does what happens later actually line up with who this person appeared to be? Because when someone disappears, people instinctively search for explanations. They look for hidden instability, secret plans, risky behavior, anything that makes the outcome feel less random. And sometimes those things exist. But in this case, they don't really settle. Brandon Swanson was 19 years old. He was in college in Minnesota, enrolled in a wind energy technology program. That detail tends to get mentioned quickly and moved past, but it matters because it tells you something about how he was thinking about his future. It's a practical field, hands-on, not abstract or vague. It suggests someone working towards something concrete. From what's been shared by people close to him, Brandon wasn't known for disappearing without explanation or cutting off contact. He stayed in touch. He checked in. He told people where he was going. When plans changed, he communicated that. So when this night unfolds the way it doesn't neatly fit the idea of someone who decided to vanish. It doesn't match the pattern of someone intentionally leaving their life behind. And that disconnect is important. The night itself begins in a way that feels almost forgettable. It's the early morning hours of May 14th, 2008, end of the semester. That in-between period where routines loosen and people go out because there's finally space to breathe. Brandon had been out with friends. There's no indication that the night was chaotic or out of control. From accounts later, he'd been drinking, but not in a way that stood out as extreme. Nothing that would have raised alarms in the moment. Around 1:15 in the morning, he gets into his car and starts driving home. At that point, everything is still normal. Somewhere along that drive, a wrong turn happens. Not the kind that immediately sets off alarm bells, but the kind that quietly disorients you. And if you've ever driven through rural areas at night, especially farmland, you know how quickly roads start to look the same. Gravel stretches on. There are no streetlights. Signs are few and far between. The landscape doesn't give you many reference points. And a few distant lights can convince you you're closer to a town than you actually are. Brandon believes he's near a town called Lind. He isn't. He's actually near Taunton, several miles away. And crucially, he doesn't know that yet, Because he doesn't know it, nothing feels urgent. Nothing feels like a situation that needs immediate help. And that misunderstanding quietly shapes every decision that follows. At some point, his car slides into a ditch along one of those gravel roads. It isn't violent, there's no crash scene, no twisted metal. The car simply gets stuck. The engine still runs, he isn't injured. And in that moment, it likely feels irritating more than dangerous. Like one more inconvenience stacked onto a long night. From his perspective, this probably doesn't feel like an emergency. It feels like a problem that needs solving. So instead of calling emergency services, Brandon calls his parents. And in context, that makes sense. It's late, he's okay, he doesn't need an ambulance, he just needs a ride. When his parents answer, what they hear doesn't sound like panic. The tone of the conversation is calm, maybe slightly frustrated, the way most people sound when plans fall apart at 2 a.m. He explains that the car is stuck. He reassures them that he's fine. And he mentions something that, at the time, probably feels helpful rather than concerning. He can see lights in the distance. And this is where the night begins to pivot, quietly. At some point during the call, Brandon notices those lights more clearly. Not close enough to reach immediately, but close enough to feel reassuring. Close enough to feel like direction. And it's possible that in that moment, he doesn't see them as anything mysterious or dangerous. They likely just look familiar. They could resemble a town sitting quietly in the distance, or a building with people still awake inside, or even a stretch of road where cars might pass occasionally. When you're standing in the dark, unsure exactly where you are, something like that can feel grounding, like confirmation that you're not as lost as you might have feared. He might have thought that if there were lights, then there had to be someone nearby, someone awake, someone who could tell him where he was, which direction he was headed, or how far he was from help. From his perspective, walking toward those lights probably doesn't feel risky. It likely feels productive, like moving forward instead of standing still. So while still on the phone, still talking, still connected to his parents, Brandon suggests walking toward the lights. And what's important here is what doesn't happen on the other end of the line. There's no immediate alarm, no sharp warning, no sudden fear. Because his parents don't hear fear in his voice. They don't hear urgency. What they hear is their son thinking through a solution, talking it out the way people do when something inconvenient happens late at night. So they agree with him. And that agreement matters, because it tells us that in that moment, everyone believes this is temporary. A short walk, a small detour, not the beginning of something irreversible. Brandon might have assumed that even if he didn't reach a house right away, he'd at least get closer to something recognizable. A sign, a driveway, a mailbox, anything that would confirm he was heading in the right direction. So that's what he does. They're driving, he's walking. Everyone is trying to line things up, flashing headlights, describing roads, scanning the darkness. At times, the call drops and reconnects, which adds confusion, but still feels manageable, like a signal issue, not a crisis. Eventually, Brandon leaves the car behind and continues walking. He stays on the phone, narrating what he sees, responding to questions. And at first, nothing in his voice suggests danger. Then he mentions climbing over fences. That detail might not sound alarming right away, but it lingers later, because fences usually mean you've left the road. He also mentions hearing water nearby. Again, not immediately frightening, just an observation, something he's noticing as he moves. If you picture this moment honestly, it's quiet. No running, no shouting. Just a young man walking through open land at night, phone held to his ear, fully expecting this to end with getting picked up and going home. And then, without any buildup, he says 2 words. Oh shit. Not shouted, not explained, just instinctive. The kind of thing someone says when something happens faster than they can process it. And then there's silence. The phone doesn't disconnect right away, and that detail matters. The line stays open. His parents call his name, at first calmly, then more urgently, listening for anything at all. Footsteps, breathing, movement, anything that suggests he's still there. But nothing comes back. Eventually, the call ends. They try calling again. It rings, goes to voicemail, rings again, until eventually the phone becomes unreachable. And that's when confusion turns into something heavier, something your body recognizes before your mind can fully understand it. Morning comes. When they report him missing, there's hesitation at first because he's an adult, which is difficult to accept when you know he went silent mid-conversation. Later, cell phone records change the understanding of the night entirely, showing the call came from near Taunton, not Lind. That's how his car is finally located in a ditch off a gravel road. And suddenly, the whole night looks different. Those lights he thought were town lights weren't towns at all. They were farm lights, a grain elevator beacon. Things that make sense once you know what you're seeing, but not in the dark. Not when you're tired and assuming you're close to home. Search efforts escalate. Law enforcement, volunteers, dogs, aerial searches. Dogs track a scent across fields, toward an abandoned farm, and eventually toward the Yellow Medicine River. The river was swollen at the time from recent rain, which becomes the main explanation people return to, because it fits the sudden stop, the silence, the lack of further movement. But despite extensive searches, boats, divers, repeated efforts over years, nothing is found. No phone, no clothing, no body. Just absence. And that's what makes this case linger. Not dramatic twists, not shocking discoveries, but the weight of ordinary moments that turn heavy after the fact. The headlights, the phone call, the idea of walking toward lights that felt like safety. Brandon did what people tell you to do. He asked for help. He stayed connected. He trusted that someone was coming. And still, the line went quiet. Somewhere between his footsteps in the dark and the silence on the other end of that phone call, Brandon Swanson disappeared. And even now, that unfinished conversation still feels unresolved. If stories like this stay with you, you're not alone. And if you find yourself drawn to quiet, unresolved cases told this way, like we're just sitting here talking through them together, you might want to stay here with Drawn to Crime.